Okay, welcome to another episode of Ding and the quiz is done. If I sound a little bit different, it's because I've invested in a new microphone. So let's get started with our Today in History. Today is the 26th of March, and our Today in History is the anniversary of a medical researcher, Dr. Jonas Salk, announcing a vaccine for polio in 1953. This was an incredibly debilitating condition which resulted in thousands of people in the early 20th century having to spend most of their lives in a piece of apparatus known as an iron lung. Right, we know the drill by now. The link for the Do Now quiz is in the description. Click complete. So pause and do the quiz. Okay, so we've looked at how Harold Godwinson spent most of 1066. We've looked at how William of Normandy spent 1066. Now the two storylines are going to combine and we're going to start looking at the Battle of Hastings. Before we look at the actual events of the battle, I want us to answer this question. Who had the greater advantage before the battle? And this essentially requires us to have a look at all of the events that we've already studied and have a look at the site of the battle and then make our decision. So, as a quick reminder, in September 1066, or late September 1066, Harold Godwinson is up north. He's just defeated Harold Hardrada and Tostig at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Meanwhile, William of Normandy has landed here at Pevensey. And when Harold gets wind of these landings and the fact that William of Normandy is raiding his earldom of Wessex, then he immediately starts travelling south to meet William at the Battle of Hastings. Now, a really important thing to note here, and something you will read when you do the reading, is that even though Harold Godwinson was the one rushing south, he did not kind of rush to meet William of Normandy. He marched to London first of all, where he arranged a fleet to cut off William's retreat and to gather further troops. And then he marched to an area just outside where he knew William was plundering, and he essentially set up and waited. So even though William was the one that goaded Harold down south, when Harold got there, he chose the site. He then stopped and waited. So this is the site of the Battle of Hastings today from the air. This essentially is where the battle was fought. This building at the top is a building called Battle Abbey. It's a monastery which was commissioned by William the Conqueror after the Battle of Hastings. And in fact, the battle site today, or the abbey today, has a plaque which is supposed to commemorate where Harold Godwinson was killed. Now, some historians believe it's actually a little further down the road, around here, well, where the roundabout is now. But either way, there's a plaque on the site of the abbey. I think it's about there, if I remember from when I visited. So this is the main site of the battle. And what's really important to note, you can't really see it here, but this area is a really, really steep slope. I went there the same day that I visited Pevensey Castle. It was really raining down cats and dogs. My other half was extremely miserable, and that was combined with having to walk up a very, very muddy, very steep slope in the middle of the rain. So the Anglo-Saxons, steep slope. The Anglo-Saxons were positioned at the top of the ridge, and the Normans positioned at the bottom. Now, when I talk about it being a ridge, I mean as in you've got quite a steep and sudden slope, which would have been perfect for the Anglo-Saxons to line up along. So we've got a steep ridge, or quite a sudden ridge at the top, a steep slope. At the bottom, we've then got an area of marshland and forest. So that's a picture from when I visited, and we can see as well on that aerial photo this kind of highly wooded area that would have been partially flooded, very, very difficult to navigate. So, ridge, forested area, and then, as I said, the very steep slope going up. You can see from the angle that archer is, how steep that battle was. So, as I've already said, you've got Harold and Harold's brothers leading the Anglo-Saxon army, and the Anglo-Saxon army are lined up along that ridge in what's called a shield wall, which is a very, very traditional Anglo-Saxon tactic. Now, it doesn't show it on the map, or on the diagram, I should say, but these shields are locked together. They overlap each other to form a very strong structure, and the video that I'm going to give you today shows you that in a bit more depth. At the bottom of the hill, just in front of that kind of wooded marshland, you've then got William, separate from the rest of his troops, on horseback, and then you've got his army, which are a combination of Normans, people from Flanders, and people from Brittany. So, Normans down here in 3 separate groups, with William leading them on horseback. Anglo-Saxons in one long line in the shield wall, with Harold and Harold's brothers fighting in the shield wall, commanding their troops from the front line. And Harold's plan was that over time further troops would arrive and reinforce him over the course of the battle. Obviously William can't do that, A, because he's on foreign territory, and B, because William has cut off any reinforcements using his fleet. So, without further ado, we need to do our usual. Let's switch quickly to the visualizer. There we go. You've got your reading. Now, the reading is from what's called an AQA resource pack. You don't have the Battle of Hastings as your historical site this year. Your historical site is the White Tower, the Tower of London, in London, funnily enough. But what essentially happens is that every year AQA picks one particular historical site which you focus on in a lot of detail, and they give teachers access to a lot of reading to do with that. So this is taken from the reading that Year 11 were given last year, because their site is the site of the Battle of Hastings. So, read through the keywords first, then go through the reading slowly and carefully, and then we'll do our next activity together as a group. Okay, so on the back of your sheets, you now have a table, and I've split the kind of really key things that you should be focusing on into 3. The terrain, so the physical geography of the battlefield, the troops that the 2 sides had, and the morale and stamina from both groups. What I'd like you to do is, for each one of these boxes, I would just like you to quickly make notes about Harold, and then William, and then in this box write down whether you think it's either Harold or William that has the advantage. Now, sometimes this is going to be incredibly close, sometimes you may not actually be able to say whether one particular side has an advantage, but give it a go. Now, I'm aware of the fact that I just did that, but actually, and I've said this before, I want you to work across that way. If you work that way, you're not going to be thinking about the overall question that we're answering today, which is who had the greater advantage. Instead, you're just going to be thinking about it in a really isolated way. So before we do anything else, we're going to have a look at an example. So the terrain and how that terrain worked to Harold's advantage. Bear with me for 1 second. I need to make sure that I'm not going to miss anything off. Here we go. So when we talk about Harold, we're going to talk about where he was in the Battle of Hastings. And as we said earlier on, and is in the reading, Harold is positioned at the top of the ridge. There's my mouse. At the top of the ridge. Now, in the reading, it specifically states, if I can find it, and I need to grab a highlighter, it specifically states that Harold was in a defensive position. The strategy that he chose did not require him to rush into battle, but merely to avoid losing one. Essentially, Harold positioned himself where he was, and then he stood and he waited. And being on that ridge is an excellent defensive position. So we can write that down, so that's good for defense. but also have given him a great view of the battlefield. And in theory, this would have been a good position for archers. Now, I'm going to put that one in brackets, because while it would have been an excellent position for archers to be in, our reading, and now I need to find it again. The Normans possessed many more archers than Harold, and in fact, the Anglo-Saxons had relatively few archers. So even though this could have been a huge advantage for Harold, he didn't actually take advantage of it. Now, why he didn't take advantage of it, historians are pretty unsure, but we do know that he had relatively few archers at the Battle of Hastings. So, now let's have a look at William. William was at the bottom of the hill. And first of all, this is going to be a massive disadvantage for him, because the majority of, well, not the majority of his troops, but the majority of the time, the tactic that the Normans would have used in this situation would have been to use their cavalry to smash through a shield wall. Right, bear with me. Here we go. This is a really, really common tactic for Normans when fighting against a shield wall. So being on a slope means that it's not that this is going to be impossible, but rather this is going to be really difficult. The horses are going to find it very tiring to gallop uphill, and it also means they can't build up that momentum that they're going to need to smash through the shield wall. So cavalry unable to build momentum. And generally, even with our soldiers on foot, our infantry, they're going to become really tired. And as the Anglo-Saxon tactic is essentially to line up in a shield wall and wait, this is going to be a battle of who can last the longest. And this puts the Normans at a significant disadvantage. So, tire out infantry. And just as if Harold had had archers, this would have been a huge advantage, it's a disadvantage for William, or at least for his archers, that they are firing from the bottom of the hill. Because they're going to have to significantly change their angle if they have any hopes of hitting people over the shield wall. So, for Harold's position at the top of the ridge, it's a great defensive position. It offers him a really good view of the battlefield, and if he'd had more archers, it would have served as a huge advantage. William's at the bottom of the hill. It's going to be very difficult for his cavalry to build up momentum and break through the shield wall. His infantry are going to tire out more quickly, although they do have better stamina at the moment than Harold's army, and it is going to be difficult for William to use archers to great effect. So, with all of that on balance, I would say that for terrain at least, the advantage lies with Harold. Okay, so that's our model. You've now got two further ones to do, troops and morale and stamina. So pause the video and then we will go through the answers. Okay, so let me just double check that I'm still doing this correctly. I am. I'm just going to have a sip of my drink. Trying very hard not to hit the microphone. So we now have troops and morale and stamina to look at. Now we've already kind of hinted at this when we talked about terrain. So Harold's troops, they are mainly infantry, foot soldiers. with very few archers. And the reason why this is important, particularly this point here, is this idea that Harold cannot take full advantage of his position. He has a massive advantage in terms of terrain. He's just not in the position to really take advantage of it. Of terrain. William's army, on the other hand, is a lot more varied. He's got cavalry, he's got archers, and he's got infantry. Cavalry, archers, infantry. Now, there is another point to consider here. Harold technically can gather reinforcements over the course of the day, and that was actually a key part of his plan, that over time soldiers from other areas of the south of England would arrive and strengthen and replace men at the front, strengthen the shield wall, replace men at the front of the shield wall. William was not in that position. He was in a foreign country, and any hope of receiving reinforcements by sea, which would have been unlikely anyway, but any hope of that has been cut off by Harold's navy. So we also need to put in the point here that William could not get reinforcements. Now, looking at these two, I've said that Harold has the advantage, but ever so slightly. It's really, really hard to call. In fact, on my teacher notes, I've even written slightly. And this largely comes down to the fact that neither side can really take advantage of this reinforcement point over the course of... It's a long battle by medieval standards, but still only one day, so that's not going to have a huge effect. And even though William's army is very varied, the issues with terrain means that he can't use, just like Harold not being able to use the terrain to his full effect, William can't use his army to full effect either. And so I'd say it tips the balance ever so slightly, purely because Harold will be able to get some reinforcements over the course of the battle. Ooh, let's just make a note there, because that is important that we're able to mirror it. Okay, so our final area then is morale and stamina, and most of your information for this should have been taken from previous lessons. So, in terms of morale, some of Harold's troops would have been spurred on by their victory at Stamford Bridge. Remember that it's not the exact same army fighting in the Battle of Hastings as fought in the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So some have higher morale because of Stamford Bridge. See my notes getting lazier and lazier as I go. You can also argue that Harold's troops were fighting for their homeland. They are fighting in defence of their country. That's going to have a positive effect on their morale as well. But, on the other hand, and again, can't emphasise this enough, some of Harold's troops would have been tired out because they had marched from the north, from Stamford Bridge. It is important to note that many of those would have been the housecarls, the most experienced troops in the Anglo-Saxon army, so that would have had an effect. Some would have been tired from marching south. Okay. Next up then, William's troops. So, first and foremost, in terms of morale, you have the fact that William's troops have the papal banner, the flag given to them by the Pope to show that this was a holy war which the Pope approved of, and in the eyes of many troops they would have felt as though they were fighting for God, they were fighting for what was right, and this would have had a massive positive effect on their morale. Most of William's troops had also been promised huge rewards and huge riches if they had opted to fight with William. It's not quite the same as fighting for your country, but you can argue that that is going to be a motivating factor. And then finally, to compare with those troops who would have had to march south after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, William's troops generally would not have been tired. They'd had several days to plunder Wessex, they'd had several weeks waiting on the French coast, they would have been well rested, relatively well fed, and ready to fight. So, well rested, waiting on the French coast. And well fed because they'd been plundering Wessex. And I would argue that looking at these two together, I would put the advantage with William. Now, it'd be really easy now to look at these three and say, oh, well, clearly that must mean that Harold had the advantage. I think it's a really, really difficult one to call. And historians from the time and modern historians have both said that this was a battle which was incredibly evenly matched. It was very, very difficult to say who had one advantage or another. Now we're going to use this to answer a convincing question. So let's get the PowerPoint back up. Oh, there's my visual representation of the battle. So you've got the shield wall along the top, William's army along the bottom, and then William's army would have fought uphill. Okay. So not last lesson, but few lessons ago now, we looked at this interpretation question. How convincing is interpretation A about Harold Godwinson's ascension to the English throne in 1066? Explain your answer using interpretation A in your contextual knowledge. Now, we're going to be answering another convincing question today. We're just going to be having a look at a different topic and a different interpretation. But as a quick reminder, you'll be given the interpretation, you'll be given the topic you're discussing, and when we're talking about whether something is convincing, we're asking how far it lines up with our own knowledge. We don't care about who wrote it, we just care about what's in it. So, let's have a look at our interpretation, which requires me to go back to our visualizer. So, the interpretation is at the bottom of your sheet here, and is adapted from England under the Normans and the Angevins by H.W.C. Davis in 1905. On any field and in any engagement on any scale, nothing short of the most desperate odds could have prevented the superiority of Norman equipment from producing their natural effect. Highlighter. Now, when Davis talks about their natural effect, he's referring to this idea of victory. So, what I now want you to do is annotate this interpretation. So pick out some keywords and phrases that you are going to be able to compare to your own knowledge. Remember, we're only really looking for 2 solid paragraphs here. So, pause the video, annotate the interpretation. Okay, so this is a relatively short interpretation, which means that focusing on individual words maybe won't result in a high quality answer. What you may end up just doing is just really picking apart single words and not looking at the overall argument. So that's what I think we need to do. We need to look at what Davis is actually arguing here. So phrases that I've picked out are superiority of Norman equipment, most desperate odds on any field, any engagement, any scale. So what Davis is essentially arguing here is that the Normans are almost impossible to defeat in any situation. And the reason why they are almost impossible to defeat is because of the equipment available to them. So if we put it within the context of what we've been studying today, what Davis is arguing is that Norman equipment always gave them a huge advantage. Now, what we now need to do is compare this argument to our own knowledge. And on the one hand, we can talk about equipment that the Normans had that not many other people did, which is cavalry. And we can use that to discuss how cavalry was really effective in dealing with the standard tactic at the time, which is the shield wall. And in a battle with very shallow or flat relief, then cavalry would have been a huge advantage, and they would have easily been able to smash through that shield wall and break up that formation, which makes that army substantially weaker. So we can talk about this idea of equipment, about cavalry being unusual, except for the Normans in this period, about cavalry being able to break through the shield wall. Now, my issue is with Davis's reference to any field, any engagement, any scale. He's essentially saying that in any battle, cavalry were a massive advantage, or equipment was a massive advantage, and led to victory. And this is something that we can pick apart a little bit here, because I would argue that this bit particularly, this idea of any field, is something that I disagree with. Now, we're going to have a look at this in a little bit more depth when we look at the battle itself, but we know just from looking at the battlefield that the cavalry's main advantage, their ability to smash through the shield wall, was largely negated by the battlefield. It was largely negated by the terrain and the fact that the cavalry would have been unable to build up sufficient momentum to break through that shield wall. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. So this is the bit that we can annotate here. William's position negated cavalry. Which is because of the relief of the battlefield, relief in the Battle of Hastings. Now, I'm not saying that this wasn't accurate in the majority of cases or in battlefields that had very flat relief. What I'm saying is that I think it's relatively unconvincing for Davis to say any field, any engagement on any scale, that equipment always was a massive advantage for the Normans. So, that's your notes. What this would then do is form two paragraphs. You don't need to do it in that order, I was just going left to right. And for each one, just as we did when we looked at our example, when we were looking at claimants for the throne, you need to take either a quotation or part of the argument, you need to tell me what it means, and then you need to tell me whether you are convinced by it or not. So, what I should be able to do, let's just quickly pop back onto the right-hand screen. There we go. This is the model that we looked at a few lessons ago when we were looking at claimants for the throne. One reason why interpretation A is convincing is because it refers to Harold Godwinson plotting to take the throne of England, which suggests that he acted dishonestly as he had a weak claim. So, and there's my typo, it wouldn't be one of my lessons without one. So, here's the bit I'm focusing on, here's what it means. And then the rest of the paragraph is, well, here's whether it matches with my own knowledge or not. And as always, we need to be really, really careful that we don't just say, well, here's a vague reference to something that happened and you're going to have to figure it out for yourself. But you need to tell me why you know that it matches up to something or that it doesn't. So, go back to your interpretation. You should be timing yourself for 10 minutes when you write this answer, and you can either word process it and email it to me, or you can take a photo of it and email it to me as well. Now, I've not mentioned this in previous videos, but I will mention this now. What I'm probably going to do is video separate feedback videos, which I will then post up on ePraise, so they won't be beautifully tagged on to the beginning of the next lesson, especially as this is going to be for multiple different groups, but I will give you the link for the feedback. Okay, so pause the video, do your writing. Okay, our final thing for today then, if you want to take it further, then, there we are. If you want to revise this section, you should be looking at section 5 from your knowledge organiser in your quiz booklet. If you want to read further, I've included an article in the description from English Heritage about the battlefield and the geography of the battlefield. And if you want to watch further, I've included a link to a short video which shows the reality of fighting a shield wall and why the Anglo-Saxons viewed it as such a good tactic. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you later.